For 70 years, the U.S. government has told churches there are certain things they are not allowed to talk about. We'll talk about the impact and the future of something called the Johnson Amendment. Hi, I'm Stuart Shepard, and this is First Liberty Live. Thank you for liking and sharing our interviews each week. We appreciate the fact that you want other people to get to see these as well. It's how we get to make new friends out there. Jeremy Dice is Senior Counsel here at First Liberty Institute. He also watches over religious institutions for us. Hi, Jeremy.
Good afternoon.
First, according to the IRS, what is it that churches are not allowed to talk about?
Well, I sure wish I knew. We think we know what they're not allowed to talk about, but the IRS is sort of a little short in coming with their forthrightness about what they actually can or cannot say. There's a lot more, I think, fear out there than is actually printed within the IRS code books or guidance or whatever you might have. But in a nutshell, churches and houses of worship should stay away from generally participating in political activity, specifically endorsing candidates or using money out of the offering plate to endorse or otherwise use for political purposes. So that's kind of a big category, and because most people don't exactly know where the line stands on that, they just sort of back away from the entire thing, which leads to a significant problem of self-censorship and chilling of speech, which we don't like either.
And the government seems to like it that way. I mean, there have been moves by various pastors over the years to preach sermons and even send them to the IRS that cross that line, either endorsing a candidate or, as they say, unendorsing a candidate if it's someone they don't want you to vote for. But the IRS will not bite. They don't want to go there because the chilling effect is what they're looking for.
The chilling effect is one thing, but then on top of that, the only way to be able to challenge this thing called the Johnson Amendment is for the IRS to punish a house of worship.
Right.
And in order for that to happen, they've got to, of course, speak on the issue, and then they have the opportunity, once the IRS has removed their tax-exempt status, to then, only then, challenge the law. You can't just simply say, look, I'm a taxpayer, and I don't like what this law is, I'm taking you to court. The court will kick you out in a heartbeat. And I would agree with that point. So that we actually have to go all the way through the entire process of basically an audit or an audit-like opportunity for the IRS to come in, examine a lot of things within the house of worship and the church. They have to send letters, they've got to have lawyers, they've got to have accountants. It's a big mess. And at the end of it, then the IRS can say, well, either slap on the wrist, you shouldn't have done that, or you really shouldn't have done that, we're removing your tax-exempt status. And then you can bring a lawsuit, but only then. So it's been really, really difficult for anybody who dislikes this piece of legislation, including me, to be able to challenge it in court because it requires a church bold enough to say something and then stand behind that thing to lose their tax-exempt status, which is a fairly significant and daunting thing. Although I think, as we might talk about, I don't think houses of worship should be as concerned about that as they are.
Yeah, I've been in and around local church ministry for a long time. I've worked for a church, I've worked for parachurch organizations, and I can say without any question, there are a lot of people who would say, I don't think any preacher should talk about politics from the pulpit. I don't want to hear that in the Sunday morning sermon. But that's not what this is about. It's not whether they ought to, whether they should. It's about whether the government has the power to say, you can't talk about this, and they can scratch those lines right out of a sermon. That's not right.
Oh, that's exactly right. And it is so anti-free speech, which we are a country that's built upon the principles of free speech and free exercise of religion. This confronts both of those things in one fell swoop. If the elders or the deacons or the church leadership, the houses of worship, the people that lead those houses of worship, if they decide they want to speak into these issues, then they ought to make that decision. Hey, if they decide they don't want to speak about these issues, I agree with that perspective as well, because it's their choice to be able to make that decision. That's what free people get to do. But when the government comes in and says, well, there's some very vague boundaries, we're going to disallow you from speaking on this very thing, even though your religious beliefs and your religious scriptures may come up against those issues in the public conversation, well, now we've got a real problem, because you might accidentally violate the Johnson Amendment without even knowing about it, and all of a sudden you've got the ire of the IRS raining down upon you. But for people like First Liberty Institute, you could find yourself in quite a fight with the IRS, which anybody who's gone through that knows you don't want to do that.
Not if you can avoid it. This law has been in place for so long that most of us don't even realize there was a time before that, a time when things were different. People may be wondering who that guy is over your shoulder there. It all dates back to 1954 and an amendment to a bill that was mainly sponsored by then Senator Lyndon Johnson. He went on to be president, of course, in the 60s. We call him LBJ. When they passed that bill, what was he trying to do? What was his target?
Well, my sense of it from looking at the historical record is that he was trying to be vindictive. There were some people, some religious institutions, some churches in the state of Texas that during his re-election to the United States Senator opposed him, and they encouraged churches and pastors to get together to oppose Senator Johnson's re-election.
Yeah.
And he didn't quite like that. Now, LBJ's famous for his temper. He's also famous for, not liking opposition like this, and he's also rather famous for being a bit vindictive at times when it comes to politics especially. And so it seems to be that on the worst case scenario, he went into the Senate, said, I'm going to pay those guys back by making sure this never, ever happens again. Now, less cynically viewed, although I think I'm probably closer to correct on the terms of history right now,
Yeah.
less cynically viewed, perhaps what Senator Johnson, then Senator Johnson, was trying to do was truly to keep religious institutions pure from any kind of political involvement. Now, I don't think the historic record supports that idea, but some modern scholars or some modern advocates anyway for the Johnson Amendment sort of want to maintain the fact that the Johnson Amendment was put into place so that religious institutions would truly be separate, thus separation of church and state, the good kind of separation of church and state perhaps. But again, I don't think history really supports that view.
Most people, it's been long enough, they may not remember, but there was even a phrase that they shared on Capitol Hill. They called it the LBJ treatment, the LBJ treatment. And he was like 6'4", and he would lean into his opposition and tower over them and kind of like like he was going to pounce on them. And was known for really getting in people's faces and pushing back on things and using his voice, a big commanding voice, to try to get his way on things. So that would suggest, at least in the general, that your first interpretation is probably the correct one on this. Prior to 1954, there's a long history and tradition of churches speaking out on things political, on what's going on in Washington. Let's talk about that history. It goes all the way back to the foundation.
Yeah, look, we're a country founded on the principles of free exercise of religion and free speech. And those really came together most often at the election season. And so there is a history of what are known as election day sermons, where pastors would get up in their pulpit and they would teach their people what the scriptures say about the current issues in that election. Some of them would, not be very complimentary of certain candidates. They would recognize their moral failings at times or their moral inadequacies, at least according to their religious traditions.
Yeah.
They would promote other candidates to say, no, these are more closely aligned to what we would believe as a religious entity. They would talk about the important religious issues writ large within the election itself, even maybe without naming names, but talking about those important issues as they come up against the church tradition that they may be coming from. And so this was a thing for a long time in our country. And it just simply fell by the wayside right around 1954 when this whole thing started to come back and say, whoa, maybe we shouldn't be talking about that lest we were to somehow come under the punishment of the government.
How would the U.S. be different if the Johnson Amendment were significantly scaled back or even repealed? What would be different?
I think a lot of fear would just simply get out of the way, because I think that's where we're at today, is that there just are a lot of pastors, a lot of religious leaders that are simply saying, I don't want to fight. I want to focus on what I want to focus on with this church, this issue, and they just simply back away.
Yeah.
Freedom of religion, free speech, those things don't die all the time at the end of a gun. They more often die the self-sacrifice death of our own. In other words, it dies by 1,000 different cuts that we self-impose upon us. And so when pastors, when churches, when religious leaders decide, you know what, I'm going to just pull that punch, or I'm not going to talk about that issue because it could get us in trouble, well, we've died a little bit of freedom at that point. We've lost a little bit of our freedom when that happens. And so my encouragement to pastors, to religious leaders, those who govern our religious institutions, don't back away from that. I mean, if God has called you to speak on a moral issue that your scriptures talk about, you should never be afraid of speaking on those points. And if the IRS sends you a letter, then call us. We'll look at it and tell you just how bad it might be, or more likely, that you got nothing to worry about.
Very good. Anything else you'd like to share about this before I let you go?
Well, look, I think it's important to remember for houses of worship in particular that the IRS does not grant you any kind of tax exemption. You as a church are tax exempt. In fact, the IRS's own language says that they recognize your tax exempt status. It's helpful for a lot of churches to apply for what's called a 501c3 designation under the IRS's code so that they can tell their donors that they are tax exempt and those donations are tax deductible. That's really helpful, especially if donors get audited or something like that. It's easy to prove that those exemptions or those donations are tax exempt.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that if the IRS comes after you, you're automatically going to never again be tax exempt. In fact, it's quite the opposite. It's true. If the IRS actually recognizes your tax-exempt status rather than granting that tax-exempt status, well, then it stands to reason that even if you were to violate the Johnson Amendment, the next morning you'd wake up tax-exempt. It may be harder to prove because you don't have the magic letter from the IRS, but you are still, as a church, as a house of worship, tax-exempt under our law. And I'll use the fancy Latin here to say ab initio. From the very beginning, you are tax-exempt. The IRS merely recognizes your status rather than granting that status.
And you're expressing this. This is an idea that a lot of pastors and churches have not considered. So I want to let you just expound on it just a little bit more, because the heart of what you're saying is this. Each congregation, by default, as soon as they form as a congregation, they are, under the law of the land, considered tax exempt. The IRS comes along and says, oh, we recognize that you are tax exempt. That's what you're saying, right?
That's what I'm saying, exactly right. And the IRS's own language says that very thing, that as you form yourself into a church, you are, by definition as a church, you are tax exempt. In fact, there is no way to define a church under the IRS except for being except for being tax exempt.
Right.
And so you really have nothing to fear. And look, again, if the decision is made by the church leadership that you don't want to engage in political activity or discussions, that's perfectly fine. I get that. I understand. But you also ought not to fear that if you say something out of the pulpit that happens to mention an election, a candidate. We had a client actually that just recently was cleared by the IRS after we got involved, who invited a candidate for school board onto the stage, and egads, they prayed for the candidate. And the IRS began an investigation over a prayer.
That's just wrong.
It's absolutely wrong, and thankfully we were able to step in and push back against the IRS, and they dismissed their investigation, thankfully.
Yeah.
But think about that. Someone was praying. Now, I have also seen, especially in recent years, several other kinds of churches of different political persuasions or ideological stripes that have been very critical of our current president. Now, I don't think that they've received an investigation from the IRS. I don't know if they have. But I'll tell you what, I would defend those churches and their right to be able to say that if they so chose to do so. Why? Because I want to make sure our houses of worship are completely free to express their religious beliefs and their religiously informed opinions from the pulpit. Whether or not I agree with them, I want them to have that freedom to be able to do that very thing. And that's, again, the decision, and it ought to be the decision of our houses of worship, and not anybody at the tax office.
It wouldn't be the first time someone has fussed with the preacher. Just saying. Jeremy, thank you so much for coming out and explaining that for us. Very helpful as we talk through that. If you want to see America's religious heritage defended, the history and tradition of faith in our culture, if that's important to you, you can make that happen by supporting First Liberty Institute. Just look for the big red Give button up at the top of firstlibertylive.com. First Liberty is fighting for what matters most.